started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second information session to discuss the future of St. Paul's. Tonight we have a panel of experts. We've got Gary Fishberg, a partner at Cullen and Dykman, Brendan Mooney, also a partner at Cullen and Dykman. They'll speak about some of the legal considerations that the village will need to think about as we move forward. And then we've got Lloyd Westerman and Stephen Taylor. Lloyd Westerman is from Westerman Construction, and Stephen Taylor is from Vakota Architecture. I just want to remind folks in the audience, if you've got questions, the mayor's got question cards. She'll be walking around. Just flag her down, and you can submit a written question. And if folks on Zoom can submit questions using the Q&A function. Do not use the raise your hand function because we will not be calling on you. Just submit the written question via Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to Lloyd Westerman and Stephen Taylor.
Everyone can hear me? Hi, I'm Lloyd Westerman and Westerman Construction, and thank you for having us here this evening.
Keep going. I got it. Go ahead.
What we do is to provide a summary and clarification to the final reports that we had issued. I want to say that we did not, it's just a different form of presentation. We didn't change any of the numbers that might have been presented to the village previously. And our basic assumptions and methodology in the three schemes, demolition, adaptive reuse, and facadism, essentially remain the same. So the items, we have a brief presentation here in PowerPoint. The items covered in this presentation, the information in this presentation is compiled by Westerman and Vakota, our architecture firm. I'm sorry. First, we were needed to assess the conditions of the existing building, which, and I just should say, I'm not going to, this whole thing is not me reading continuously. There's lots of images coming up. But just as a way of introduction here, the basic assessment based on a visual review, a general review of typical roof construction, general review of typical masonry construction for buildings of that era, review of previous assessment reports. Then the second big point is the nature of the cost estimates, the description of the scope of work for each construction assessment, and what assumptions we had to make for assessment. And that's a very important point. There is no designer, there's no program, which means there's no specific use intended for this building at this point. It was sort of left up to us to come up with some form of guidance on what we felt in each of the three categories was needed to be done to provide a cost. And that's what we did. So our team consisted of my own firm, where we've worked in many of these kinds of buildings over the last 30 years. Stephen Taylor, Vakota Architecture, who I have worked with in an older building like this on exterior restoration school, in fact, prior to this. And then we had a mechanical engineer, Lohr Consulting, and we hired a historic consultant, Gregory Dietrich, and the structural engineer was Sean Fennell, Fennell Engineering. So this is the site I'm sure you're all familiar with. And in going into the existing conditions. So I have been to the building 5 times at this point. I think, Stephen, you've been there 3. Yeah. And a common question is, how can we say that it's in great shape parts of it require a substantial amount of remediation. Well, it's like if you broke your leg or you injured your finger, you can repair that, but your whole body is not doomed. So we walked all around the building and felt perfectly safe. We were with the building superintendent and constructions, the building department superintendent, and we felt very comfortable walking around the building. The building doesn't smell bad. There's no animals living in it, so there's no dead animal smell. There's no smell of mold or dust. It's very static, and when you walk on the hallways, as illustrated in the next slide, underfoot, it feels very solid. If you jumped up and down, it's not going to like vibrate. Plaster's not going to fall off the ceiling, and it felt very, very solid. There are areas that are severely compromised or basically even collapsed into themselves where severe water intrusion occurred. And frankly, kind of rain we had last Friday comes into that building, it's not good. And windows that are slightly open or a small penetration in the roof can cause that kind of flooding and damage to the building, which is particularly accentuated in the winter if water gets in or snow and then it freezes that night, the water expands and makes the opening even bigger, and it creates a cycle of intrusion. And it's typical in these old structures, but that's not to say that they can't be attended to at this juncture. So this is typical of the water damage where plaster's falling off the ceiling. Not unlike if you're in your house, you have a small leak, the sheetrock bubbles up, or if you're in an older house with plaster, bubbles or the paint cakes off. Very similar occurrence here. Maybe the details are still in very good shape. Here's some details. This go to this one. You can see a window here. This is an area where these windows are like mini dormer windows. So there's a slight protrusion outside the building. You can see it, and that isn't. It's like so. It's got its own little roof, no bigger than this table here, and there's many of them, and that becomes an area of water intrusion. And we have other more detailed photos we can show you in a second. So these are some illustrations that we've done. And this one with the red is a slice through the building. You can see the bays, and this is kind of important. This is a structural bearing wall, and this is a structural bearing wall, and then this is a structural bearing, and this is a structural bearing wall. And wood joists or beams span from the brick to this wall, and again from this brick to that brick wall. And what's important here is you can see the basic structure of the building. And in fact, it was very solidly built. But when we get to the facadism concept, you'll see what we figured and why we figured it that way. This shows the typical construction of a mansard roof, which is very complicated and frankly isn't the best roofing system, but that's what they did 150 years ago. And that's what's on the building now. And it would have in adaptive reuse budget and the facadism budget, there's money set aside to repair this. And on the extreme right just shows you floor frame and juncture of the inside with the rest of the. You can see the dormer windows that I mentioned. It's where water can come in. Next slide. So here's the typical way. So these openings on either side are through brick walls, and the brick walls are holding up the building. These are illustrations of standard construction from that period of masonry with stone cladding and joist system, and very typical of what we're faced with here. Thornton, like the town, the village, retained the very excellent engineering firm Thornton Town Setting in 2019. And they put an outstanding report if you really want a technical understanding of the state of the building. Some of these photographs we borrowed from and from the report. And the report is excellent, mostly dealing with the elements of the facade and the roofing, the envelope issues, as we call them. Less so of the interior, but they do comment. But it goes into great detail about the state of the building, and that would be beneficial to any of the teams going forward who would be tackling the building. We'll talk about the environmental issues now briefly. There was a planning assessment that there was asbestos in the building, but according to the terms of our contract, we also had to assess it, and we did. And for the purposes of doing any of the phases of work with respect to asbestos, we determined where the asbestos is, and all three budgets include asbestos abatement according to the state and federal guidelines, with a complete containment, people in Tyvek suits, sealing up the whole area, properly packaging up in small bags, and taking it away to appropriate landfill and getting manifests for that. So the whole procedure for asbestos abatement is according to the standards in all three budgets, and it's the exact same. Lead, if present, would be conducted at the same time of any of the demolitions of the phases. Area work to be covered in plastic and material made damp during removal. Keeping the dust down is the most important thing during any kind of demolition operation, and that's standard process now. And if necessary, the ground area around the building could be surrounded with plastic, and the windows within 20 feet of the building could be also covered with plastic, even during the demolition phase, to just maintain the dust in the building. Yeah. So there's also two excellent websites that you can go to: the New York State Asbestos Law and Regulations and the New York State Lead Environmental Regulations. And you could also go to the CDC website and the OSHA website, for that matter, and see what their relationship, their understanding of lead in the environment is. Should we want to do the other slides now? Yeah, we'll just do some more pictures in a second. Okay, we don't have to shut down. Okay, good. All right. No, do the other. This is obviously, sorry, this is obviously the building recently. This is the typical parlor. I think on the as you go up the stoop into the what appears to be the front entrance of the building, there's a typical rooms off to either side that were probably lounges and living room type spaces originally. This space is a little bit more decayed, but still not bad. Here's an area of water intrusion. The village came in and shored it up at some point to keep the building from imploding there. It's the typical hallway on the ground floor. This is the area below the what's called the chapel. That was probably where their dining hall was. This is a typical classroom, and this is a typical of all the rooms. The living rooms are all, where the kids resided are all about the same size as this, and with a window typically. And this is pretty much of the same, exemplifies the status of the rooms throughout the building. This is the grand stair. These are some of the detailing that you can see on the wrought iron of the stair, which is in excellent shape. We walked up and down the stair and it felt completely safe. This is the chapel. Unfortunately, the chapel is in really bad shape. The organs is a total loss. In all of our budgets, we included demolishing the chapel but saving the stained glass and preserving it. And I think we had an allowance for restoring it as well. Okay, this is an area, and this is an interesting picture because there must have been a terrible leak here over a period of time. And then basically what happens is that the wood beams rot and collapse under the weight of the radiator that's at the window side. But I'm standing right here, and we felt perfectly safe standing right on the edge of this hole. Now, obviously, I wouldn't recommend non-professionals to go in and look at this kind of thing, but it shows you the kind of state. So that's bad, but it's a limited area and it can be fixed. So anyway. Same here, water intrusion, the plaster in the ceiling, which, by the way, the white plaster compound was all tested negative for asbestos. Typical residential hall upstairs. Again, another area, and you can see the radiator hanging there on the top of the picture. Another hallway. This is one of the stairs in the wings. This, unfortunately, it was not cleaned out at the time. And again, here, this is a little bit better. You can see the damage to the bricks on the left arch, and the window was boarded up, and that kind of decay that occurs with constant water intrusion at those dormers. And this is what happens when it's neglected. And again, this is the outside, the stairs. We also figured in the adaptive reuse to rebuild these stairs as a means of egress. This is the porte cochere, I believe. No, maybe this is the side of the main entrance. Yeah, that's it. So that's pretty much the state of the building right now. These pictures are from about a year ago, a little bit less. So demolition, to clarify the scope of works: secure existing building for safety of the workers, abate all the asbestos, and then demolish the St. Paul School and the cottages. Provide clean soil for site infill, plant grass and trees. The way we've represented the budget now doesn't include masonry salvage, but that would be something for the village to choose whether to do or not. You have the numbers that I estimated it would be at, and the question is, of course, not only if you wanted to salvage the parts of the building before you tore it down, but what would you salvage and how much? And there's not any real guidance on that. You might want to hire a historic preservationist or a consultant, and working with the village, you can decide what might be beneficial to retain for future use, if at all. We had previously included staving the stained glass, the wood that you saw in the hallways, and some of the masonry on the exterior. And then this is what the sequence would look like. Basically, it's pretty simple.
this slide, you can see where the cottages used to be, where the St. Paul's landscape is removed, and we have the remaining site would be infilled with grass and
Trees,
minor
mature
trees. Yeah, but there's no current plan for landscaping per se. Just this is a estimated budget number.
Yeah, we replicated the environs that are around the building now, and that is in our budget, is to backfill into the basement new topsoil and grass and plant mature trees. Could you show the demo slides?
Oh, sure.
Okay. This is a building on 124th Street, just off of Fifth Avenue near Marcus Garvey Park, that my company demolished in the last 2 years. And I believe that the equipment that would be used to tear down St. Paul's would be similar. It's basically this giant machine with a huge claw that twists and turns, and it's got tremendous hydraulic power, and it basically pulls the building apart. And the guy operates it from inside that cab. And then while this building is being pulled apart, they have other heavy equipment that separates the steel with like other grappling devices, and then backhoes that would put this debris into a trailer and then cart it away, and keeping this watered down during this process. And I'd say this is very important. The building that you see with the big white blob there is a branch of the New York Public Library, a Carnegie branch that never closed while we were doing this demo. So kids were going to reading and checking out books the entire time that we were doing this demo, and it was completely safe. No one from the neighborhood complained, and this machine does the work very quickly. It was like this building was maybe 100 feet long, and it took maybe 2 weeks to tear it down. So again, here you can see, and then the truck is covered with sheets of plastic to keep the debris in the truck from getting into the atmosphere while they're driving down the road. And there's the other piece of equipment that sorts out the steel and the rubble. And again, the library's on the right. And then the next picture, that's the actual library branch right there. We had to put sidewalk shed in front of it. And this is how we conducted the operation, and without incident. Okay, we're firing up the adaptive reuse. Well, I can read it while you're looking. Secure existing building for safety of workers. Again, abate all the asbestos. Remove all non-load bearing walls. All walls, ceiling, floor finishes on all floors. Now, I'll explain why we need to do that. And our structural engineer brought a moisture meter, and he was feeling that some of the beams were wet, even though they felt not wet. And he figured that upwards of 30% of the joists or the beams that are holding up the floor and tying the building together were compromised or would become compromised in the near future. So in the adaptive reuse budget, and to a lesser extent in the facadism budget, we included replacing substantial amount of joists with new joists. But in order to do that, you have to tear up the floor and the ceilings, and take down a lot of the walls between the rooms when you're going down the hallways. And but it could turn out to be less, or it could turn out to be more. We didn't sample every beam, but this was just a conjecture based on our few visits and the sampling that he did at the time. He estimated to be about 30%. And, you know, because wherever there was water intrusion, spreading out 20 or 30 feet from either side of that could start compromising other beams. So we feel comfortable with that estimate, but again, it won't really be known until you start to design what is the necessary to do the adaptive reuse. Repair the stairwell, the skylight, the chapel stained glass, woodwork, doors, roof, replace all the windows. The original estimate only had us replace the windows in the areas in the front of the building that we call the white box, which would be turned over to the community immediately for development into some kind of space as yet to be defined. But working with the current trustees and the mayor, it figured that boarded up windows would not be appropriate for Village of Garden City. So we included all the windows being replaced, which was only added about $3 million. And that's in our budget now. And the windows that we figured to be replaced would be the latest energy efficient technology, double pane. We would install new gypsum board on all finished public spaces, which we'll show in a second. For fire rating, new flooring in the public spaces, subfloor on half the building. And the reason why that's done is so that we can put less, we plan on heating the areas of the building that are not occupied, but only minimally to maintain it at about 50 degrees year round, so that the building is preserved. So if and when, if the village adopted this approach, they could expand into the building would be structurally sound in order to do that. We put sprinkler systems throughout the building. Currently, the building is not sprinkled at all, and that presents a very dangerous situation. And in both our approach to adaptive reuse and facadism, the building is completely sprinkled appropriately. We also included fire-rated doors at the public areas, a new elevator, ADA access, bathrooms, heating systems that would heat the building, the areas that would be turned over to the village immediately for expansion at a comfortable level in the winter, and air conditioning, not fully ducted central air conditioning, but air handling units mounted on the side of the rooms, and that would be sufficient, according to our mechanical engineer, to make it reasonably comfortable. It's not going to feel like a retail store, but it's going to be, would be reasonably comfortable, and it could be easily supplemented going down the road. We figured lighting and electrical throughout all those areas, which we'll show you where they are in a second to clarify that. All work included from our construction estimate from June 14th. Future completion of unfinished non-public spaces, the east and west wings would require electrical, HVAC, and plumbing upgrades depending on their use. So we have minimal heating, but and the heating system would be electric using reverse cycle heat pumps, which is the latest that the government is pushing for heating and cooling buildings. So this is a exploded view of the building. Essentially, the areas in purple are the areas that would be, and if you could imagine this room with no furniture, nothing hanging on the wall, no acoustical ceiling, but just fresh walls and a floor that you feel comfortable walking on, that's pretty much what our budget includes to turn over these spaces so that they could be then used for whatever purposes the village ultimately decides to use them for, which is not included.
And to clarify, the spaces in blue go from the basement. We were trying to maintain minor accessibility for egress, ADA adaptability, as Lloyd mentioned, for heating, cooling of the building, maintenance of the building. So even though the facade gets updated and fixed, we want to make sure that the interior of the building is tempered to maintain the quality level and the maintenance that was put onto the exterior. And the public spaces go from just the entrance area on the first floor, the chapel area on the second floor, because that's connected by the main stairwell. The third floor just has another connection from the main stairwell. The fourth floor at this time would be left as an unfinished space. And as you can see, we try to diagram that as simply as possible.
Incidentally, ADA stands for American with Disabilities Act, which is the federal requirement that any building is accessible to anybody regardless of their physical capabilities. This is, I'll let Stephen talk here.
So this is just a more detailed floor by floor. The areas in blue are the areas that we would call conditioned spaces. Conditioned mean that they're available for public use. The areas that are in white, again, would be off limits to the public, but they would be sustainable in the sense that they would have heat to be ready for future use at some particular time. But in order to create a stable building, we would have to incorporate construction of the entire building throughout the process. And as we mentioned, maintaining the current codes for egress, fire protection. So the hallways would be limited at points with fire rated doors. And we would include an elevator, which would be an ADA requirement or American Disability Act requirement for accessibility to each floor.
I just want to add, so we just chose this. We at earlier meetings there were a set of drawings that were posted in the village hall showing the transformation, and this was what we thought was at least some direction that the village wanted. You could develop any part of the building you want with our budget. You know, you could just do a wing. So we were not told to do this specific area. It wasn't in guidelines for our RFP, but this is what we chose in order to give you a budget on adaptive reuse. I should say the biggest chunk of money in the adaptive reuse is fixing the building. So that's extensive amount of money to exterior restoration, rebuilding the mansard roofs, re-roofing it, bringing in new electrical service, new water service, putting sprinklers throughout the building. That is a huge chunk of the budget there. Okay, so now for facadism. Again, follow the same procedures as we would in the demolition and in the prior two phases. If you recall, I pointed out the bays of the structure, the bearing walls, they're layered, and the way we figured the facadism approach was to save the facade and save the first bay of the building, which you can sort of see diagrammatically here, and then provide some support. But the budget, if you go into the detail of our cost presentation, what we had intended initially for facadism was to provide, I should just, the facadism is the most complicated thing to figure. And the reason why it is because it's dependent on what happens after you save the facade. And if you knew exactly what you wanted to build behind the facade, then that could be joined to the facade and would become part of that project. And the method in which the facade would be preserved and saved would be totally integral, heart and soul, into the new building and part of that process. But we have no guidance on what is supposed to go behind the building. So what I initially figured was to save one bay and then provide steel supports and seal off the whole building, sprinkle what's there, provide minimal heating. And so you have this shell that can sustain itself until such time as the village decides what to do behind the building. If you decided not to do anything, the higher number budget included just letting it sit there for years and did not provide for any public use, however, but did provide that if the town highway department or the building department needed to inspect it periodically, or you hired some service to go through the building, they could safely go through the building and conduct and make sure that, you know, vandals weren't breaking in, kids weren't breaking stuff, and that the building was essentially secured. So it'd be safe from that standpoint, but it would not be adequate for community use. So then the current administration wanted us to make it more acute, and so the budget that we have, which is, again, we didn't change the numbers, we just took out the ability to preserve the building indefinitely. And so what we're now saying is, if you were to select the lesser number, that you really have to build something within a few years after conducting that procedure. Something has to be connected to it.
So we were following the direction of a previous report by Erwin Belinsky from 2012. They had given some direction on options that you may have discussed in previous meetings. This one, as Lloyd had mentioned, preserves the south facade, or the quote front facade, and a first bay of the building with a support structure in preparation for a new facility in a moderate amount of time, opposed to preserving a facade for an exponential amount of time.
So this is a building in Mexico City that one of my employees happened to take on a vacation there in the last few years. And as you can see, they saved the facade, but there's this incredibly complex network behind it just holding up the facade. In this instance, you will never be able to join a new structure to that, because this system was put up just to hold the facade without any thought of what new building might be built behind it. And overall, that seemed to not fly with anybody. So we didn't ever do that approach. The approach that we had chosen was to do something that could give you time to decide what to connect to it. And so the floors would still be there, and you could still join into that. And that would include those parlors that are up front. So the parlors that are up front could be merged into a new structure.
And then to reiterate what we mentioned about the structure, if you remember how the building is a masonry load-bearing walls divided into bays with wood floor joist structure. The roof, which is the most complicated section, is entirely wood and is dependent on its own structure. So that's why you can see the red that we have. As the support structure grows, it becomes a little bit more complicated as you go up and as you define on how to restore the building. This one. So ultimately, based off of the previous reports, the south facade would be salvaged, restored in a similar way that we would do the adaptive reuse as well. We would provide new windows for the building. We would re-roof, repoint the walls, remove any contaminants in the building itself, and then create a support structure underneath. So as you look at the face of the building, you would see a clean building that seems ready for occupied, but once you turn around to the rear side of the building, north side of it, you would see a giant support structure.
Yeah. Sorry, when we get to the costs, I'll explain. The higher cost estimate includes where you see the red structural network. Go back. Yeah. It includes much more steel and cladding that with some kind of metal panel system, so that from behind it wouldn't look ugly. while you're waiting to attach to it. But in this case, and that's why we say 2 years, it's just left exposed. All right.
Sorry, to reiterate too, what we had in our previous reports, you may have read from our original assessment. The building, once you repoint the masonry, install windows, a masonry building is a live building, which means it continues to move, absorbs water, deteriorates water outside of it. So once you create a conditioned space, it allows the water to move in one direction, which would be away from the building. If you have a block wall with no conditions, the water is able to penetrate inside, outside, which is why in the pictures that we show, there's certain areas of deterioration where floor joists have deteriorated. It doesn't mean that the building is condemned or in a dilapidated state. It just means in certain areas there is compromised floor joists, but the building still remains structurally sound. So it's oversimplification.
Yeah, so recognizing that, and I saw this at prior meetings, that it's very controversial what should go behind it. I just want to read what the direction was that we were specifically given when we answered the RFP that was subsequently included in our contract. It just says include alternate proposals for maintaining existing east, west, and south facades with the structure designed to support the facades prepared by a licensed structural engineer. In this case, we used an architect, and that's it. It doesn't say anything about any buildings that are supposed to go there. So obviously everybody in this village, I have learned, has their own opinion about what should happen to this building. And so we're just vaguely suggesting, 2 options, a big blob, which is more on the style of a Home Depot or a Costco or whatever, a big box building that you could use for indoor tennis courts or a theater or whatever, and then something a little bit more distinctive. Now, obviously, more distinctive would cost more money. But again, we didn't budget all of that. We just budgeted saving the facade so that ultimately you could join something to it. So the way the numbers now are presented, and again, we didn't change any of the costs. The current trustees and mayor didn't say, well, this price is too high, lower. Or you're not figuring enough here. No interference in our numbers whatsoever. But in this case, we're showing that the demolition, this is pretty much the pure demolition number with backfill and returning the area after the building is removed to parkland like what is there immediately around the building now. And we left as an aside, which the village could use about $5 million for the whole salvage concept. And you could pick and choose what you want to salvage down the road. And that is just something that it's just their food for thought. In the adaptive reuse, the budget increased slightly because we added windows throughout the entire building using the same unit cost that was identified in our budget originally. And in fact, Stephen and myself just completed several hundred windows for a school, and we have a very good sense of what a large window replacement project would cost. So we think that number is very accurate. And again, this 52 million includes you leaving the fronts of the building up to the 3rd floor and some of the basement for some use, including the hallways where you could hang artwork and have an art exhibit or whatever. Put up the kids' local school artwork products, science products, whatever. And then the facadism, we took out a lot of the drywall, the fire protection, the plumbing, the HVAC, and basically left it a structural shell, which would really dictate that something be done with it within 2 years, or you'd have to go back and add all that stuff if it needed to be left indefinitely. This is our basic idea of the schedule. The demolition would take at most 6 months, but probably the worst of it would be over with in a couple of months, and could be done in the winter when the fields are perhaps in less use. The adaptive reuse would take the longest, 20 months, and that's only you know, if during that period you decided to expand further into the building for program uses that have yet been defined, then obviously the schedule would take longer. But it's not inconceivable that it could be structured in such a way that the building could be fixed, the services brought in, and then the front of the building could be made occupiable while work was going on elsewhere in the building, like it does in any office building where there's work going on the 18th and 19th floors and people are occupied on the 12th floor. That same thing could occur in the adaptive reuse. And facadism, we figured about 40 weeks, and that's just to prepare the building as discussed.
And these numbers are estimated time frames or for construction purposes. So we didn't account for in our budget architectural design, building approvals, zoning, village approvals, whatnot. So these timelines are based off of the actual construction timeline. During demolition, I think it's important to note that there would be a containment area around the building. We'd have to make sure public is protected in the site area. So something that would have to be reviewed on limiting accessibility to the construction area and understanding that there are buildings around in the neighborhood. So that's something that would have to be reviewed and make sure that that safety is maintained throughout the process.
I just would like to add, though, to that, you know, every day of the week, a huge building is torn down in New York City with people living all around it. And there are strict guidelines, and if they're followed, there should not be any issues.
Yeah, so that's it.
Yeah, I think that's basically the end of our presentation. And then I'll turn it over to these guys on my left. And I guess if you have questions, you'll fill out the question cards.
Just a reminder for folks who on Zoom who have may have questions, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom screen, and you can type in your question. We'll address it at the end. Thanks.
All right, good evening. Is that okay? All right, good evening. My role tonight is to talk about the restrictions on the St. Paul's property and some of the significant events that have happened over the years that have basically gotten us to this point in time. First, as we all understand it, there's parkland. There's a parkland designation on the property. It means the property is impressed with a public trust, and that means it only can be used for public and recreational use. And what constitutes parkland or public and recreational use is really defined by case law. And there have been many, many cases that deal with this on an individual basis. There are a number of impermissible uses that have come out through these cases. Probably the one that's most important to the village is a case known as the Kenny case, which occurred back in the about 2000. This is, and we'll get into this a little later, but that case established that this property could not be used for a senior assisted living purpose. There are other impermissible uses, again, defined by case law: schools, streets and highways, museums, landfills, composting centers, public works facilities, storage space, shopping malls, housing, both public and private, commercial or retail space, hotels, medical facilities. Again, every one of these has been defined by a lawsuit that's come up that has challenged a parkland designation and an attempt to use parkland for some other purpose. Now, there are also many cases that deal with permitted uses in parkland. And again, they're not defined by statute. developed over time by court decisions. And those uses are things like sports and recreation facilities, including batting cages, golf course, skating rinks, pools, and equipment, associated equipment facilities that will support a park. Community event meeting space is a permitted use. Rooms for music, dance, art programs, a theater, associated concessions and offices that support a park facility, parking lots that support a park facility, restaurants, cafes, when furthering a park purpose. And there was one case that involved bike share stations, whatever that may be. All right, a little history on the building. The building was built by at the direction of Cornelius Stewart, who built it as one of several buildings in the village, including St. Mary's and the cathedral. They were built in honor of her husband, Alexander T. Stewart. And the building was opened in 1883 as a school. In 1993, the Episcopal Diocese had filed for bankruptcy, and they were looking to rid themselves of this building. They had no further use for it. And the village undertook what was called a friendly condemnation. They condemned the building, and the reason it was condemned rather than an outright purchase was to try to remove any kind of encumbrances that might be on the property. Anybody who would claim that they had any kind of lien or any kind of ownership interest in that building or any reversionary interest in the building. So the building was acquired through a friendly condemnation to wipe out any such claim. And the village paid for the building in 48.6 acres. The village paid $7,290,000 and floated bonds. And there had to be a referendum to approve the bonds. And that referendum actually passed. I think the bond issue was probably for about $8.5 million, something along those lines. And it passed 2,726 yes and 364 no. So as this was going on, the first mayor's committee to review what to do with the building was formed. It actually was formed in 1992, actually before the village actually officially required the building. And that mayor's committee brought in structural engineers and other experts to explore uses for the building. And village looked at uses like moving the village hall there, fire department, police department, the court, community rooms, and also looked at the question of marketing the building for some kind of commercial, cultural, educational, or residential use. And there was very little interest in the building from outside sources, except for one type of development was interested in the building, and that was assisted living facilities. And in 1996, there were 6 proposals received from various assisted living facilities. And 2 of those proposals actually were further explored and made presentations to the village in 1997. And that was 2 companies, one called Care-Matrix and another one called Capson. And I think Capson actually was in conjunction with the Albanese Corporation, if familiar with those folks who have built a lot of buildings in Garden City. And the village eventually decided that it would enter into an agreement with Care-Matrix to build an assisted living facility, and that was in 1998. So after that happened, there were some people in the village that didn't agree with that that use of the building, and a lawsuit was commenced. And that lawsuit challenged the use of the property for a private entity, for Care Matrix, and sought to enjoin the village from using the property for other than a recreational use. And when the building was acquired, when the land was acquired originally, there was no mention of acquiring it for parkland or recreational use. The village avoided doing that because it wasn't sure whether it would stay as a parkland. But the Nassau County Supreme Court found that, and this is a quote, although the instruments of conveyance do not contain restrictive language, i.e. involving parkland, the property was utilized for recreational purposes and therefore was, quote, impressed with a public trust, and that a privately owned assisted living facility for seniors was inconsistent with the public purposes for which the property was acquired. So the court basically said, notwithstanding the fact that the village didn't state that it was acquiring the property solely for recreational purposes, the court found that that's what the property was being used for, and that's the only use that could be put to the property. The village appealed that decision to the appellate division. They upheld the Nassau County Supreme Court decision. It was an appeal to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals denied the appeal. So there we were with a parkland designation through the court proceedings. But in order to make sure that there was no doubt that it would be a parkland designation, in 2005, the village board actually adopted a resolution declaring St. Paul's to be a parkland, and there was a 4-4 vote at the village board. And under Garden City's unique system of breaking a tie, it was a 4-4 vote, and the mayor at the time, who was Barbara Miller, cast a vote for declaring it a parkland. So in 2005, the property actually was officially designated as parkland. Now, some people have raised the point of, what was the school district ever involved in this? What happened? Was the school district ever interested in the building? Was there anything done by the school district to try to utilize the building? And the answer was yes. The school district expressed an interest in the building and actually came up with a few preliminary designs to move the high school to St. Paul's. But that was about 1995. But during that process, there was an inquiry made of the State Department of Education, and the State Department of Education ruled that the school district could not expend any additional funds to adapt the St. Paul's to as a high school. Couldn't expend any additional funds over and above what it would cost to build a new high school from scratch. So basically, the education department said that they put no value in the adoption, or the adaptation, I should say, of the building, of the St. Paul's building for school purposes. If the school district could build a new building for less money, it was impermissible to spend additional money in order to move into the St. Paul school. There's been some other discussion about a private operator coming in and leasing the building and maybe leasing it back to the village, and that private operator would then basically own the building and lease it back. Court of Appeals has also addressed this issue. They've said in several cases that parkland cannot be leased, even for a park purpose, unless there is what's known as an alienation of the parkland. And we'll get into that in a moment, but that basically means that the state legislature has to approve the use of the property for other than park purposes, or for other than the uses that it's currently involved in, and that alienation process is a lengthy process, and it requires that a bill be passed in the legislature to permit what's called an alienation of the property, to allow the property to be used for something other than a park, or allow the property to be used, owned and used, or owned by someone else. Even if it's used as a park, there's still a requirement that there be this alienation process. And that's, that there's multiple steps that have to be taken in order to have alienation. And that can only be done if you have sponsors in the legislature, in both houses of the legislature, the Assembly and the Senate, and there has to be what's called a home rule message. The village board has to pass a resolution asking that there be an alienation of the property, and that home rule message has to be passed either by 2/3 of the village board or a majority of the village board plus the mayor, in order, again, to request that the state legislature adopt a bill to, quote, alienate the property. And again, there are many steps to go through the alienation process, and there are also several restrictions if the alienation is to be, or the building is to be operated by a private operator. There are a whole series of rules that would apply to that. For those of you who want to do more research on this, there's a pamphlet that you can find online that's called, it's put out by the New York State Parks Department, called A Handbook on Alienation and Conversion of Municipal Parkland. It's a 69 or 70 page booklet that lays out all the rules on alienation. But the bottom line is, in order to allow the property to be used for other than a park, or even to be somehow leased to a private entity, you must go through this alienation process. And again, it requires that the village board commence the alienation, the process, by filing what's called a home rule message. That's what I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Mooney.
Great, thanks, Gary. Can everyone hear me? Good evening, everyone. My name is Brendan Mooney, as was mentioned before. I'm one of the members of the Environmental Practice Group at Cohen and Dyckman, and I'm here this evening to give you some information regarding the environmental review that would be required for the St. Paul's project. And as I work my way through the slides, what I'm really referring to when I talk about the environmental review is the review that's required pursuant to state law, which is called the State Environmental Quality Review Act. And as I work my way through, I'm going to be referring to that as this, seeker or the seeker review. One of the primary functions of seeker is to ensure that municipal agencies and municipal boards consider the environmental ramifications of the actions that they take or the projects that they approve. So that's important to consider here, because when it comes to the three alternatives that are currently being considered, whether it be demolition, facadism, or adaptive reuse, seeker will be applicable. the village will have to undertake some type of a seeker review before it undertakes to move forward with the project. And essentially what seeker is, it's a process. It's a set of procedures that the village needs to go through before it acts. And very early on in that process, what the village has to do is make a significance determination. In other words, the village needs to answer the question, will the project have a potentially significant adverse impact on the environment? And the way that it does that, it uses a few tools that are provided through seeker. There's the seeker regulations, there's seeker guidance, and there's something that's called an environmental assessment form, which the village would need to complete and essentially answer questions as to what's going to be involved in the project, how much impact would there be to various environmental resources, and using that information, again, it's got to answer the question, will the project result in significant adverse environmental impacts? If the answer to that question is yes, then the board would be required to issue what's called a positive declaration and would have to prepare an environmental impact statement. If the board were to say no impact, no significant environmental impact, then it issues what's called a negative declaration, and that essentially ends the environmental review for the project. So let's go to the next slide here where we talk more about, well, what happens if they do find significant environmental impact? What's involved in the environmental impact statement process and preparing what's called an EIS? As you can see here, there's a number of steps. The first is called scoping. And scoping, essentially what that is if the village would be required to prepare an outline or a framework as to what would go into the environmental impact statement. And first what it does is it prepares a draft scoping document. And that draft scoping document is then put out for public review and comment. And then the village would look at the comments that were obtained from the public and produce what's called a final scoping document. And again, that final scoping document would then be used as the framework and the outline for the draft environmental impact statement. Now, the draft environmental impact statement is a document, and it can be quite a lengthy document depending upon the number of things that are evaluated in the EIS. But what it does is it describes what the action is. It describes the potential impacts of that action. So it would look at what is the current conditions of the property and what's going to change. What's going to change in the village? What's going to change in on the property as a result of the action? It also looks at potential mitigation measures. In the event that there's a significant impact, what are the things the village can do to mitigate that impact, to reduce the potential impacts associated with the action? And it also will look at alternatives. What alternatives could be pursued by the village to potentially reduce the adverse environmental impacts? So once that draft EIS is prepared, that document is made available to the public to review and to comment on. And after that has taken place, the final environmental impact statement is prepared. And the final EIS would include consideration of the comments that were given during the public comment period, and in some cases incorporate some of those comments into the final EIS. And then once the final EIS is prepared, it's only at that time that the village will be able to make what's called seeker findings and make its final determination on the proposed action. So, I raise this because there's a significant amount of process that is involved in that environmental review. Next one. Here, with regard to St. Paul's, we have the benefit of having already gone through this environmental process once before. Back in 2009 and 2011, when the village was considering demolishing the building and demolishing Ellis Hall, it went through a seeker process. And at that time, the village determined that there would be potential significant adverse environmental impacts. It prepared an EIS that assessed a number of potential impacts to various environmental resources. And it also assessed what would happen with hazardous materials during construction. And it also looked at the potential impacts from construction itself on the property. In addition, the village looked at various mitigation measures that could be used to reduce impact, and the village looked at alternatives that could be considered to replace what at that time was being considered for demolition of the two buildings. I raised this prior seeker review for a few reasons. One is that the EIS documents provide a lot of information regarding what the village's perspective was on the potential environmental impacts from construction at the property, what the potential impacts were to historical resources, the community character, to land use in the village. So it's a tremendous resource for village residents to review that information, and all of that information is on the village's website. So you can take advantage of that and take a look at that document to get a sense of what happened previously and what the village's review included back then. The other important thing about that prior environmental review is that it kind of serves as a baseline. Now, if there's going to be a new project that's going to happen at St. Paul's, that environmental review could serve as a resource for the additional environmental review that may be needed. So the village board could look at that, residents could look at that, and that could serve as a baseline going forward for what additional impacts may need to be reviewed. The other thing is it's useful to get a sense of the timing associated with the environmental review. Back in 2009, the village began the environmental review in the spring of 2009, and then it culminated in the issuance of the final EAS in the winter of 2011. So overall, that process took about a year and 9 months, a year and 10 months to go through. And we'll talk a bit later as to whether the village could use that EIS going forward, hopefully to expedite the process in the future. So there's been questions as to, okay, once we get through that seeker process, what happens if someone's not happy with it? What happens if there's someone who's not happy with the decision of the village with respect to the alternative that is selected? Could the seeker review conducted by the village be challenged in court? And certainly, the answer is yes. Someone could bring an Article 78 proceeding to challenge the sufficiency of the seeker review, and what they could argue that the proper procedures were not followed. They could argue that the village didn't take a sufficiently hard look at the potential impact to certain environmental resources. Or they could also argue something like, the review is segmented. For example, if facadism was selected as the route forward, and the village was considering facadism followed by the construction of a large entertainment building or theater, and the village only looked at the initial step, which was facadism, and didn't look at the second step, someone could say, no, that's a segmented review. You can't do that. So the impact of litigation on the seeker review, again, it comes down to timing. If someone was to challenge the seeker review and they went into court, in addition to all the other remedies and trying to find that the review is insufficient, if they argued to the court that they should be entitled to what's called a temporary restraining order or a preliminary injunction, that could then halt the village's efforts to move forward with the whatever alternative is selected. And so there's been questions as to how has that worked in the past with other seeker reviews and other projects. And I looked recently at another example of a project nearby, which was the development of the UBS Center in Belmont Park. That project moved forward and was approved in 2019, and there the adjacent village, the village of Floral Park, challenged the approvals that were given, including the seeker review for that development. And when Floral Park went into court, they asked the court for a TRO, and in that instance, the court said no, they hadn't shown the proper elements, so to speak, to warrant the issuance of a TRO. And in that instance, because the court didn't issue a TRO and eventually did not issue a preliminary injunction, the the continued planning and then eventual construction at that site was able to continue. But it's an important consideration that if there was a group or a group of residents who wanted to potentially oppose and delay the implementation of whatever is selected as the alternative for St. Paul's, that is something that just needs to be considered, that there could be delay in the event that they're successful at court. And ultimately, if a group opponent is successful in court, what happens is the seeker determination is remanded back to the village board to further review the environmental impacts or to make a further determination for seeker purposes. So in summary here, again, the village board is going to have to comply with seeker regardless of which of the three alternatives is pursued. If there's a potential significant environmental impact that is identified, then an environmental impact statement would be required. And the village would have to decide whether it should reuse the 2009 EIS that was prepared, whether it should prepare what's called a supplemental EIS, building off of that 2009 EIS and creating a supplemental EIS, or it needs to decide whether it should create a new EIS, go through the process again. And again, those all would impact the various timing considerations that would be factored into the village's decision. But again, there's a tremendous amount of information on the village's website with respect to the environmental review and the secret review that had occurred back in 2009 through 11. And I certainly encourage folks to take a look at that to become more familiar with those documents and the process that resulted in their preparation. And with that, that finishes my portion of the presentation.
Okay, just a reminder, if folks on Zoom, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A function on the Zoom screen. So we're going to go through, there's been a number of questions submitted in the room here. So I will go through those and you folks can answer as appropriate. There's only two legal questions that I see, so why don't I hit those first? The first one, if alienation is pursued, would this impact on the entire 48-acre parkland property? If alienation of only a portion of the parkland property, how would an alienation proposal be framed?
Well, the alienation, if there was a desire to alienate the property, basically to just deal with the building, that could be done separately. It wouldn't necessarily have to be applied to the entire property. It could be applied to a portion of the property only.
Okay, thanks. Second question, can taxes be raised more than 2%?
Well, there's a state cap on taxes that is tied to the cost of living, and that state cap is, I'm not sure what the number is today or for this year or what it will be for next year, but yeah, if the cost of living goes up more than 2%, that state cap would allow the village to go to, something in excess of 2%.
Okay. So these, the next several questions are for Stephen and Lloyd. The first two are kind of related, so why don't I read them both and then you guys can respond. Can you tell us how the athletic fields could be affected by adaptive reuse, facadism, or demolition? And the second one is, some claim demolition is unsafe toxic, and will affect the fields. Is it safe given EPA and OSHA regulations?
Yeah, so the first, the answer to the first question is that we didn't consider the athletic fields at all. We were just hired to consider the building. And obviously, segueing into the second question, what we budgeted that proper procedures would be followed so as not to impact anything beyond the fence, basically, that's currently around the building. And as I illustrated earlier, you can demolish a building right next to a branch of a public library and keep that library open the entire time.
Okay. Next question. Is there a less expensive facade alternative that would save less of the front and incorporate it into a new building? So I guess the question is, when we talk about facadism, is it saving the full facade, or could you just save, say, you know, the entrance and build a building around that, something like that? I think that's what they're asking.
I think that's a exponential question, where you could save any part of the building if you decided, you know, one front, you could save the bell tower. It comes down to the program, but finances. So I think our proposal is the entire south facade at this period.
Are all the questions in?
All the questions are in right now, right?
It occurred to me that Stephen should define what he means by program. We were discussing this earlier.
Sorry, sometimes we use architecture contractor speak. Program is what the space is used for. So this is senior center. So the program for a senior center would be, you know, housing areas, common spaces, staff areas. So when we speak about program, we think about the use of the building.
I guess just to clarify, I don't think the question, as I interpret it, is about what the programs would be, but if you build, instead of putting a building behind the full facade, just, you know, save the front entrance, for instance, and build a building behind that, or incorporate that into a structure. That's what Absolutely, I think they're asking.
Yes. Yeah.
That'd be a choice.
Okay. Right. All right. So next question. Proponents of preservation refer often to phase 1. What is that? Is there a phase 2 and 3? When do they begin, and what do they consist of?
Right. Well, if you were to consider what we figured for adaptive reuse as phase 1, then that would be to spend a fair amount of the money we budgeted for, as I said earlier, to save the building, to preserve it, restore it, and keep it from decaying any further, and putting in place roofing materials and windows and facade maintenance that would cause the building to last for a much longer period of time. So phase 1 would include that, and then include fitting out for a yet undefined programming in the front entry parlors on the first of the basement, the first, second, and third, a little bit of the third floor for some community use. And then theoretically, subsequent phases could be, you could have 5 different or 10 different phases. That's what the village would choose as far as your budgeting was concerned, and your tolerance to deal with the project would be to expand into the wings on, and depending on what floors you'd want to go up to. And it was discussed to build a structure between the chapel and one of the wings, and that structure could be a pool or a theater or whatever. And so all those things would be considered as subsequent phases, and that is not defined at all at this time.
Thanks. Next question. Does the cost include a full design plan, blueprints, and everything else which will be needed in order to issue a detailed RFP?
So that's a good question. Our budget is pretty much just a hard cost budget, and includes engineering necessary to do the work that's included in that budget, like in the case of the demolition, to shore up parts of the building, to keep them from collapsing prematurely, that kind of thing. But the actual cost of design is not included. In the case of the demolition, it's very small amount to file drawings to say that you're going to take a building down. In the case of the adaptive reuse and the facadism, it could be substantial, but I would say typically 10 to 15% of the cost of the work. So.
Yeah, about 10 to 15% of the cost of construction tends to cover architectural, engineering, and mechanical fees, specialty fees. Beyond that, which would be acoustic engineers, lighting engineers, more design.
It depends on the program.
Correct.
Yeah. It depends on the programming, all the different various disciplines you would need to bring to the table. That's why we didn't include anything for that.
Thank you. Next question. Is there an estimate of the cost of furniture, window treatments, finished flooring, etc., for the 33,000 square foot area?
The answer to that is no.
Just jumping ahead, if there's more of that, the program that we were asked to budget during the feasibility study is the restoration of the buildings. So the construction techniques provided in cost estimates are to restore the building and bring particular areas up to a public use, but those uses have no particular programs. So items such as finishes, as Lloyd mentioned, if it's a particular use of a requires specialty engineering, that's not part of the program.
Thank you. Next question. I think it says, confirm that estimates have a 10% contingency factor.
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
But is it 10% or is it?
Yeah, I
more or
think
less?
so. Yeah, so we included 10% contingency and 3% escalation. Yeah, a couple of years.
So to clarify, there is a 10% contingency on all the budgets, and we've included a 3% escalation costs. Escalation costs is presuming costs are going to go up over the years until a final budget is determined. So that's the escalation costs are included.
Thank you. Let me go to this one. Where did $120 million facade number come from? No, sorry.
That's
right.
not for this. I'm sorry.
Oh.
Did I give you a wrong?
No comment.
This was, there
Yeah.
was a, this was a three.
On the presentation.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. This is a three-part. All right. So I assume just this portion. Sorry.
Yeah.
When they did demo on 124th Street and 5th, did they have to close Central Park?
Actually, it's right up against Marcus Garvey Park. Central Park is about a mile and a half south of there, and they didn't have to close anything. The street, the park. There's a public pool in the park, and various courts, basketball courts, I think tennis courts, pickleball courts, and none of that was closed at that time. And they're also immediately up and down the block, various public assistance housing, and none of that was closed either. And I point out that Bill Clinton's offices are immediately behind on 125th Street, and he still came to work, apparently.
Okay, thank you. Next question. This is for Lloyd and Stephen. Your report features several photographs of deteriorating areas in the main building. Approximately what % would be in the condition as represented by those photographs? Would an entry atrium address and renovate the areas in these photos?
Yeah, if the question pertains to the severely decayed areas where the floor is collapsed, it's about 20% of the building.
Okay, thank you. Another construction question. Will will any of the construction contracts to vendors, i.e. mechanical, electrical, et cetera, have to comply with New York State Wicks law regulation?
I would, unless there was some creative approach to this project, absolutely. And in addition to that, we figured prevailing wage, of course, for the project. There are means in which it can be modified, and it's complicated, but Wicks law can be, yes, but it can be assisted by hiring a construction manager who then can make sure that the general contractor is properly coordinating with the mechanical trades, who tend to, in a smaller project, not be necessarily properly supervised. So construction manager could organize the whole effort. And on a typical very large project in the state, that's what's done to make sure that that happens and that things are done correctly.
Thank you. Okay, this next one's a little bit long, but I think you'll understand what they're asking. It said, it relates to facadism. If the village was to decide on facadism and the village had plans to support the south facade and at the same time to incorporate and build a new structure behind the facade, would the steel structure to support the facade have to be as substantial when only the facade was supported initially with no structure behind the facade? In other words, would there be cost savings to support the facade and build the structure at the same time, rather than waiting, some period in between?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I'm sorry, hold on a second.
Design something mechanical, structural about a year. The more complicated answer is once we have a program, the defining the program I think would take the longest time. So programming, again, defining what the building needs to be. Once you define what the building is, the ancillary programs being if it's a gymnasium, if you have storage areas, offices, etc. If it's a simple structure that has different programming, and then understanding the code review under that structure. So I think the short answer would be about a year for design work, and then there's a process of permitting, et cetera, after that.
It's a little confusing, but this is a legal question. If the school structure is demolished, I assume they mean St. Paul's is demolished, can New York State change the park designation under eminent domain?
No, again, it takes New York State can initiate this. I don't know if the discussion or if the question is suggesting that New York State can initiate it. The state can't initiate it. The village would have to. And if we're talking about St. Paul's being demolished, no, the remaining property, if St. Paul's was demolished, would still be considered park property and under the Park Trust. The eminent domain question, again, New York State doesn't have the right to to condemn that property and remove the park designation. No.
Okay, another construction question. In past meetings, it was suggested that the pure facadism, because of its height, would be difficult to maintain. Your report indicates it would be good for a few years. Would it be more practical to just demolish the 3 fingers of the building rather than the front 6 to 8 feet of the facade?
That's a very good question. I'd say yes. That is another possibility. In addition, then that front section was utilized, would save energy expenses in the rest of the wings not being there anymore.
Okay, well, those are all the questions that I've received, both in the room and on Zoom.
I have some questions here that will be addressed either in the FAQs or some were more comments, and so we can address them in another forum. But we're limiting this to the presentation so that everyone can understand what we've heard from legal and the building experts.
So if that's it, well, I think the mayor just explained.
That's about right. I'm with you. They wouldn't take my question. I'm sorry. You know what? I got this today in the mail from the guys who would like to convert St. Paul. And yes, people will look at it and say, this is bad. This is fantasy. And we're not addressing it.
You know what, actually, I have comments that I received from both sides. I think this could turn into a lengthy debate in the room, which is not the purpose of tonight. So I appreciate all of the input. I am saving those questions. They will either be okay. So I have any questions that weren't responded to. We have them, we hear them. Many were comments, and I recognize the room has advocates on both sides of the issue here. This could turn into a lengthy debate this evening, which was not the purpose. It's being recorded, and the purpose was to share the information on legal and construction that was in the form. So I will speak with you afterwards about the forum that would be appropriate for these other comments, and I appreciate your input.
Okay, well, if that's it, we'll wrap it up. And thank you all for attending. And I want to thank you to the panel for your time and your expertise in answering the questions. Thank you very much.